Planning and Zoning Committee of the City Council. All committee members are present today except for Councilor Borrego, who is not attending. We are meeting today via Zoom. This is a remote or online meeting where all participants will be on a video or audio conference. We are holding this meeting remotely so that everyone can participate safely while we are conducting business under a public health emergency. We appreciate your patience as LUPS meetings are conducted this way. Members of the public will be able to address the committee if they have signed up for live public comment per the instructions published on the agenda and on our website Friday. Speakers will be moved into the meeting and will remain muted with their camera off until they are called upon to speak, at which point they can turn on their camera, unmute themselves, and will have 2 minutes to provide comments to the committee. After that, they will again be muted and return to be an attendee of the Zoom webinar. Written comments were also received and distributed to the committee members in advance of the meeting. Members of the public, city staff, and the media have the ability to view this meeting live through YouTube and Zoom webinar. The live stream can be accessed from most smartphones, tablets, or computers. For those watching on the live stream, thank you for joining us. We will start with public comment. Hello to those joining us to provide public comment. Here are the public comment ground rules. Comments are to be addressed to the committee members only. Please keep your comments germane to the topics on the agenda. Any disruptive conduct or non-germane commentary will result in removal from the Zoom webinar. Each speaker will be given 2 minutes to provide public comment. The timer will start once you begin speaking. Then the Zoom moderator, Mr. Moya, will let you know when your time is up. Mr. Moya, would you please call the name of the first speaker?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Our first speaker is Dan Regan. Mr. Regan, please feel free to turn your video on, unmute yourself, and your time will begin when you start speaking. And you have 2 minutes.
Am I audible?
Yes, sir. Please proceed.
Chair and members, one of the whereases of the brand new narrow states that many steps were used to ensure that inclusiveness, equality, and democratic processes are standardized in the updated ordinance. The process used to create the new narrow was not inclusive. Out of 222 NAs identifiable by the ONC, only 42% of them actually participated in the NEP process. 58% of them either could not be contacted or chose not to participate, and you refused to share the raw data from that survey. The process used lacked equality. NAs and coalitions asked for 17 months to be included in the creation of this new narrow and were ignored by the sponsor of this bill. Meanwhile, NAOP, a recent Business Outlook article, that it has been turned into an influential organization that has a seat at the table for government decisions. That's not equality. Democracy has to do in part with the voice of the people being allowed to be heard and given credence. The NEP report stated that the city absolutely needed to reestablish trust with the residents of the city, and immediately the council uses a process that excludes all residents from a dialogue seat at the table in the creation of a totally new narrow. You cannot use a process that is not inclusive, lacks equality, and is undemocratic to arrive at a policy that ensures inclusiveness, equality, and democratic processes. That's a form of delusion. Not as bad as calling January 6th a love fest between very fine citizens and the Capitol Police, but it is on the delusional spectrum nonetheless. Thank you for your attention, and hopefully you will hear me. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Regan. Our next speaker is Dr. Joe Valles. Dr. Valles, please feel free to turn your video on, unmute yourself, and your 2 minutes will begin when you start speaking.
Okie dokie. I just want to remind you of the widespread dissatisfaction with both the process and the results of a 4-year venture into creating a whole new narrow. We would also remind you that there has been no meaningful discourse with the public. 1.5 or 2.0 minutes is insufficient to have a meaningful discourse. You know that. We urge you to have at least 2 public meetings with neighborhood stakeholders who will be immensely affected by this legislation. We can read the hows of 071, and I mean the hows, how you're constructing it, but have lacked the opportunity to ask the whys, why you came up with these hows. We need that opportunity. It's about consent of the governed after all. There's a sense out here, though council portends to invite testimony, and sometimes it's evident in post-public comment that some on the council are not really listening, nor do they seem to read what we out here put so much time and effort toward trying to make a better Albuquerque for us all. Surely we can do better. That's my statement, and I thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Valles. Our next speaker is Jane Beckel. Ms. Beckel, please feel free to turn your video on, unmute yourself, and your time will begin when you start speaking.
Thank you. Madam Chair, my name is Jane Beckley, and I'm the president of the Santa Fe Village Neighborhood Association, speaking today on behalf of our neighborhood association regarding the current proposal to revise the narrow. Our board has significant concerns about multiple provisions in the proposed legislation. Mostly these are outlined in my written comments submitted earlier today. As a board, we reviewed the text of the narrow, the city response to neighborhood and resident concerns. The text of my written comments was reviewed by the board and unanimously approved at our last meeting on Sunday, August 8th for submission to the LUPS. The concern I address right now is the requirement that neighborhood association representatives outline how a position was determined when making public comment. This requirement effectively disadvantages neighborhood associations in presenting a position to the city or any city board or commission. First, this requirement diverts a significant portion of very limited time for comment to outlining how a position was reached, rather than being able to speak to the key points of the neighborhood association position. Individuals and other entities commenting are allowed to go directly to making their points. Secondly, this provision seems to offer a mechanism for discrediting or discounting a neighborhood position based on how it was reached. Is a position less relevant if it were reached by the board alone rather than a meeting of the general membership, or if there were dissenting votes, even when a majority supported the position? And finally, I think in the past, I have been asked to take an oath that I was speaking the truth, usually when making comment. And it seems to me that if one has done that, that one's position as a representative, if it's that stated, should really be accepted. And thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you, ma'am. Our next speaker is Kathy Adams. Ms. Adams, please feel free to turn your video on, unmute yourself, and your 2 minutes will begin when you start speaking.
Thank you very much for letting us speak today. What I want for you to hear from me is I want you to understand the depth of disappointment that neighborhood volunteers are feeling as they have reviewed the narrow. We simply do not understand how this document benefits neighborhoods in any way. We do not see any evidence that the NEP process was considered or used to inform this revision. We are asking what data was used to inform the revision process. Without any explanation, counselors, we are losing trust. Without any explanation, we have to wonder what information or whose opinions were used to make the changes. We have not had any opportunity to talk with you or to have you talk with us, and we need to hear you discuss this document. We actually want you to establish eye contact with us to let you know that you are involved. I want each of you to tell us how the problems were resolved in the previous narrow and what improvements were made. I would like for each of you to take the time to tell us what you think is the very best part of the new narrow and how you think it is going to benefit the function of neighborhood associations. I would like to hear you tell us why you think neighborhood associations are important. You want us to explain our reasoning, and I'm just asking you to help us understand. Please use this meeting to have an open discussion among yourselves so that we can better understand the work that you have done on this ordinance. Thank you. Thank you for your time. And please, please talk to us.
Thank you, Ms. Adams. Our next speaker is Natalie Rivera. Ms. Rivera, please feel free to turn your video on, unmute yourself, and your time will begin when you start speaking.
Good afternoon. I am Nat Rivera, homeowner in the Orchards that exits onto 118th Street. I am also a director on the board for the Anderson Heights Masters Association. We have 856 homes in Sandstone Trails and the Orchards that exit onto 118th Street. And there's a new development being built on 118th Street that will, according to the developer, include about 500 homes. So today I am coming to you in support of resolution R21-182 to extend 118th Street from Dennis Chavez Boulevard to I-40. I want you to be aware that those are 1,000 homes that I'm talking about, and that's just those three neighborhoods on 118th Street that right now are impacted by the traffic to Atrisco Heritage High School, as well as situations such as July 27th, in which 2 people were involved in an accident and died, and that closed Dennis Chavez for multiple hours, resulting in those thousands of homes having to go through side streets and add over an hour to all of the commute as that those deaths were investigated and that traffic accident was investigated. Additionally, Dennis Chavez is rarely plowed when there's snowy weather or ice storms between Coors Boulevard and 118th Street. So you're creating a very dangerous situation in which thousands of homes are trying to get out of there and access I-40. It is imperative that 118th Street be connected to I-40. Please prioritize connecting us and making us part of one Albuquerque, because right now there is 2 Albuquerques and we are taking 20 minutes to a half an hour to even access the rest of Albuquerque. I'm begging you on behalf of every home that exists on 118th Street and all of the homes, the hundreds of thousands of people that are impacted by our traffic going through Unser 98th Street, Coors, and Atrisco Vista Boulevard just to get to I-40. Thank you.
Madam Chair, looks like Councilor Pena may have a question or comment.
Thank you. Councilor Pena?
Hi, I just actually had a question for Ms. Rivera. I just was hoping that she could kind of describe some of the conditions as you just did, but 118th where it closes off at Amole Mesa. If you don't have access to Dennis Chavez, can you kind of describe a route for thousands of people that you described on the Southwest Mesa? And then also looking at just the development even north of where you're talking about, all the residents that just Westgate, Old Westgate, New Westgate, all the way down to Central, how they're impacted with the traffic there and the lack of access to a major road.
Yes. So when Dennis Chavez was closed the other day, our option was to go back and get to I-40 and then go all the way up to Atrisco Vista and around, which adds about 7 miles of drive time. It's about a 10-minute addition. Or you can go through the side streets, which is 118th to Amole Mesa. From Amole Mesa, you can go down to 98th Street. For my particular situation, I was coming up Dennis Chavez from I-25. So I had to go Coors to Blake up to 98th Street and then cut over to eventually Amole Mesa and come up that way. Those streets are getting wear and tear of those neighborhoods. But additionally, all of Westgate and all the neighborhoods that you just mentioned are having to come up through Amole Mesa in order to access those 3 schools Atrisco Heritage having I believe the third highest enrollment of any school in Albuquerque, third only to UNM and CNM. So that is all of them backed up on 118th Street. There are times where I can't even get out of my neighborhood because it only at this time exits onto 118th Street because Colabel is not yet finished, because that development has been in the works for about a decade. But so there is only that exit. And so I've had to sit waiting for the intersection of Dennis Chavez and 118th to change so that people can access the school in non-COVID times for about 45 minutes, just stuck in my own neighborhood. We really need the ability to get out of our neighborhoods and to access everything, access our jobs.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Ms. Rivera. Thank you for being here. I appreciate your comments.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Pena. The next speaker, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Our next speaker is Renee Horvath. Ms. Horvath, please feel free to turn your video on, unmute yourself, and your 2 minutes will begin when you start speaking.
Good afternoon. Can you all hear me? Okay. Yes, I wanted to speak on the NARO, and I just found out this morning that you were going to hear it today at LUPS. I know you already introduced it at City Council. I didn't know it would come up so quickly, but I do want to express that a lot of people do have concerns about this new ordinance, and I do think we need more time to go over it and have our questions answered. Well, there is a lot of questions, like why are we changing so much? Why was there a moratorium on putting new neighborhoods, keeping them from forming? Because that has affected a lot of people on top of that mesa who were going to be impacted by a lot of this development going on, but they were not being notified. And if they didn't run into somebody like me that says at the hearings, they would not have known about some of these issues. And so there is questions, why was there a moratorium? And then there's also the question about if we don't meet all the criteria, because you did change some of the criteria, and we do have some questions about that. If we don't meet all the criteria, then we're unrecognized, right? And then if we're not unrecognized, we're not notified, right? So I think we need to have some questions answered. And that's why Joe Valles was asking for a couple of meetings to kind of go over this stuff, have these questions answered, make sure we're on the same page, and maybe adjust a few things before we approve it. And that would help quite a bit. Otherwise, people feel like you're railroading this thing quickly and through, and they don't trust that. And especially when they have all these questions that need to be answered. And that you're trying to put the neighborhoods out of business. That's the comments I'm getting. So I'm just sharing that feedback with you. So maybe we could schedule some meetings like Joe Valles had mentioned and get these questions answered and maybe adjust things so
Thank you, Ms.
it will
Horvath.
work for the neighborhoods. So thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Peggy Neff. Ms. Neff, please feel free to turn your video on, unmute yourself, and your time will begin when you start speaking.
Good afternoon. I leave my video off to represent many of the people who can't get on today. In fact, I've been kicked off several times and it's a struggle. But again, I'm calling for Councilor Benton, Councilor Jones, Councilor Gibson to recuse yourselves from all things IDO. I, for one, am, and among others in Albuquerque community, believe that you are all too deep into the benefits of this new ordinance to see clearly how you are harming residents, homeowners, and local businesses. The discussions at this point have gone far into considering that you and your continually administratively sanctioned participation and direction in the IDO's implementation, including this narrow issue, may actually have criminal intent. I believe that when community voice is truncated or removed, that this causes harm to my community. It has been brought to my attention that it is illegal to legislate, which is what you are doing here now, that you knowingly cause harm to community members. Narrow takes away our voice. You are harming our community. Why in the world would you not be embracing those elders who have come forward to suggest improvements and to ask for a place at the table? Why would you not open it up to a wider group to actually discuss the things that are important? I agree with all the things that have been said here by my colleagues. You have my suggestion of a tiered approach to neighborhood associations. You have my suggestions and my concerns regarding the abuses of current HOAs. I also have a deep concern about why this committee and why you as leaders in discussing the narrow have not brought forth a review of the HOA Act. I think that you are doing harm to our community. I'm asking you to stop and think about the criminal implications that you are carrying forward.
Thank you, Ms. Neff. Madam Chair, that concludes public comments.
Thank you, Mr. Moya. Councilors, we're going to go a little out of order today, and we'll take up items B and C first. Let's go to agenda item B 072. Councilor Benton.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. At the request of the administration, I move a deferral until the next LUPS meeting, or excuse me, to the LUPS meeting on
September 15th.
September. Yes, thank you.
Members, there is a motion to defer until September 15th. Do I hear a second? There's a motion and a second by Councilor Gibson. Any comments? All those in favor of
Michelle will do roll call.
Oh, I'm sorry. Michelle does roll call. It's been a while.
Counselor Benton,
Yes.
Counselor Gibson,
Yes.
Counselor Pena,
Yes.
Counselor Jones.
Yes.
And that passes on a 4-0 vote to defer to December 15th.
Thank you. Councilor Benton, you're next again with agenda item C 073.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Also move at the administration's request a deferral till September 15th on 073.
I'll second that motion. Councilors, are there any questions? Then we'll go to a roll call. There's a motion and a second.
Counselor Benton,
Yes.
Counselor Gibson,
Yes.
Counselor Pena, Counselor Pena,
Yes.
Counselor Jones.
Yes.
And that passes on a 4-0 vote, defer to September the 15th.
Councilor Benton, the next agenda item is A 071. Councilor Benton, you're muted.
Thank you, Madam Chair. On 071, this is repealing the Neighborhood Association Recognition Ordinance, Section 1418.2, replacing it with a revised Neighborhood Association Recognition Ordinance and prescribing responsibilities and services offered by the Office of Neighborhood Coordination and making revisions to the integrated development ordinance related to neighborhood association notice. I move a do pass.
Councilor Gibson offered a second. There's a motion and a second. Councilors, do you have any questions for staff or administration or any comments?
Actually, Madam Chair.
Yes, Councilor Gibson.
I do have some questions that we have been collecting. I'm sure the councilors have been as well. Some of the mail that I'm receiving is really pretty general in content. So when I do respond to these constituents, I'll ask them, can you be more specific? What is it that you're not seeing in this ordinance that you'd like to see, or what's in the ordinance that you don't want to see, and why? And so every once in a while, we get some detailed questions, and clarification on what it is that they're having a problem with, issues with. So if I may, I notice that we have Ms. Baki here from the ONC. With your permission, Madam Chair, I would like to just ask that maybe, I've got four questions here, but I think we can dispose of them quickly.
Absolutely, Councillor Gibson, if you would just go ahead and ask the questions of Ms. Baca.
Thank you very much. Hello, Ms. Baca.
Hi, Councillor.
My first question for you is there anything in this ordinance that prevents either neighborhood associations or coalitions from collecting dues?
No, the ordinance does not prohibit charging dues. It simply makes membership and voting not predicated on charging dues.
Charging or collecting dues?
Yes, correct. There are actually several neighborhood associations in the city right now that do not collect any dues. They raise funds in a variety of different other ways.
Okay, so let me just give you an example. I live in Jerry Klein Park neighborhood. And you know what? I can't remember if they charge. I think they do.
Mhm.
Yeah, they do charge dues. Let's say I haven't paid my dues, but we're going to a meeting in which there's going to be voting items on the agenda.
Mhm.
Could I be prevented from voting because I have not paid my dues that I'm supposed to have paid?
No, under the new NARO, voting and membership are not based on paying dues.
Gotcha. Thank you very much.
You're
My
welcome.
next question is, does this ordinance allow for coalitions to continue to exist unrecognized? You know, if they're unrecognized now, can they continue to exist after this ordinance is passed?
Sure, they just wouldn't be considered recognized. So there's nothing that would prevent them from existing and calling themselves a coalition, but they would not be considered recognized under the city ordinance.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
And what is the benefit to to the recognition of a coalition?
Being recognized means that the coalitions they'll receive developer notification under the IDO. They do currently receive it as a courtesy. If the NARO passes as it currently is, they will be considered an actual official recognized neighborhood coalition, and they will have legal standing under the IDO. Is that correct, Petra?
Madam Chair, councillors, yes, that's correct. They would be treated as a neighborhood association, and so they would get the standardized notice from the IDO as well as having appeal standing.
Very good. Thank you so much. Last question. Thank you for your patience with me, Madam Chair. Last question is, what would be considered a reasonable attempt? What would qualify a reasonable attempt to give notices of annual meetings to everyone residing in a neighborhood? That's come up a couple of times.
Mm-hmm. So reasonable attempt would mean, utilizing something like a neighborhood sign. If an association does have a sign, those generally tend to be put in prominent locations within the city, within the neighborhood boundaries. So that would be considered one way of giving reasonable notice. Other associations utilize things like social media, which has a pretty significant reach depending on how it's used. Flyers can be disseminated. Some associations choose to use mailed flyers to try and reach out to as many people as they can, or they'll go to door to door. Our annual report requires that we ask for some sort of proof of how the neighborhood meeting was noticed, such as a social media posting, if it was posted on a neighborhood sign, if it was posted in a newsletter. Some neighborhood associations have newsletters. They'll send out the notification using that. Some associations have email lists. That's acceptable as well. Some associations do text threads. That's acceptable. Word of mouth is acceptable. There's any variety of methods that could be considered giving reasonable notice.
Very good. All right. Thank you so much for that. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Councillor Gibson. Councillor Benton, are there any other questions from councillors?
Yes, I'll defer
yes,
to other
Councillor
councils, but I I would, if I could follow along with from Councillor Gibson's question that was answered by Petra. Maybe Petra could give a little bit of background on the fact that this issue of standing in the IDO and that this is actually expanding that to include coalitions.
Oh, I do. Yeah, I see it. And I keep looking, but there it is.
Ms. Morris?
We're having a little,
yes.
we're having a little sound difficulty. Give us a second.
Sorry, there we go. Madam Chair, Councillor Benson, yes. So when the IDO was adopted, it carried over the notice requirements that we had under the previous zone code, which referenced the narrow and gave notice requirements to recognized and registered neighborhood associations, one being neighborhood associations and the other being coalitions. And so what we're proposing under the narrow with the recognized neighborhood associations and the recognized coalitions continues basically the same process that we have today, where if you're in an area that has a recognized neighborhood association or a recognized coalition, those two points of contact will get notice. It's their responsibility to disseminate that information to their membership, to speak with their membership about a position, and then to share that at the relevant board or commission. The difference with the narrow today versus the narrow that's proposed is that we have a little bit more information about what's required of coalitions. The coalitions are proposed to have a physical boundary to be not to be overlapping with other coalitions. And I think that's it, but I'll have to defer to Vanessa on that because she's the expert on the narrow. Councilor Benson, did that answer your question?
I just, there were these, to make clear that in a way these changes were foreshadowed by the IDO, which did give some recognition to neighborhood associations. Is that correct?
Madam Chair, Councilor Benson, yes, that's correct. The IDO is what establishes the notice for development applications, and the narrow is what describes who gets that notice. And so there is an interconnection between the two in that respect.
But I think if and maybe Mr. Melendres might want to take this one, but the issue of standing, Mr. Melendres, that as we know, every citizen has a standing of sorts, and but that these are organizational standings that are given to groups with regard to land use matters that are superior to that of an unrecognized group. But could you clarify that a little bit more of why this is important, at least to some groups of people, that they have that standing on land use within the IDO?
Sure, Madam Chair, Councilor Benton. So it does relate to notice, which has been sort of the discussion so far. Under state law and other laws relative to who is entitled to notice for various zoning actions, state statutes do prescribe that folks within a certain distance of various actions are entitled to notice. And generally, given that entitlement to notice, you can pretty much confer that people being noticed have standing to bring an appeal, for example, of a zoning matter. So if the EPC hears something and somebody was entitled to notice, that suggests that they have a potential impact to themselves or their property that is sufficient to confer upon them sufficient standing to appeal to the city council and potentially even further. So what the narrow does is that it confers an automatic standing upon impacted neighborhood associations, even beyond what notice or standing would sort of generally be conferred by analyzing state statutes. And so the concept is that by virtue of their existence and organization, they've sort of demonstrated an interest that could be sufficiently impacted such that the IDO confers upon them this idea of standing to appeal a decision of the EPC, the ZHE, to bring that to council and to have that voice without any additional questions asked that may be asked upon others who would have the burden of proving standing as opposed to having it conferred automatically.
Thank you. Councillor Benton, you're muted again. Any more comments or questions? And then I'll go to Councillor Pena.
Yeah, let's go to other counselors. I would just in advance though say, I'd like for the folks who spoke, the key points of what they spoke to, people who spoke today, to ask staff to address those, the ones that were not already addressed by Diane Gibson's questions and the answers to those questions that she made. I think I would like to hear that. I agree. We should discuss it and address each of the questions that were asked in the general public comment. And then I might have a few that I think we will still have from the letters. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Benton. And Councillor Pena is next. May I ask her to give us her question, and then we'll go through the questions that were asked before. Are you okay with that, Councillor Benton? I'm sorry, we didn't hear you, Councillor Benton.
That's fine.
All right. So Councillor Pena has it, and then Councillor Gibson. So Councillor Pena.
First question is the motion on the floor is for a do pass?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so I'd like to ask the sponsor if they would consider a no rec to full council, just because this is such an important issue that I think that we should discuss it amongst all the councilors. It gives more time and more opportunity for input from the public as well. And then my other question is that to Mr. Melendez is really, in terms of being recognized, the history of neighborhood associations and why an organization, and this is just to help to just clarify things in my head. So if you have a neighborhood association, can technically somebody start a neighborhood association and just not want to be recognized by the city? And is the purpose of a neighborhood or the recognition is because of the reasons you stated previously, but is it a requirement of being recognized? Does that make sense? Because if you live in a neighborhood, and let's say I start a neighborhood association, I decide not to get recognized through the city of Albuquerque, shouldn't I still be afforded notice if I'm within those boundaries and I'm an organization that has some interest?
Madam Chair, Councilor Pena, so first of all, I think the first question is, can you start a neighborhood association and notwithstanding anything that the city has to say within its narrow? And the question is absolutely yes. The narrow does not prevent anybody from organizing in the form of a neighborhood association and engaging in any amount of community work or engagement. The second question relates to whether or not you should have notice if you're sort of a neighborhood association that formed in that way and is not necessarily recognized. So you would have notice sort of indirectly as an entity, because to the extent that any of your members are within the area that the IDO or statute would require notice for, then by virtue of your members, then notice would presumably come to you as an organization, in which case you could take whatever action through your organization that you would deem to be fit in whatever decision-making, capacities that you determine. However, as an association, you would not necessarily, as an entity, community entity, own property, or have an address associated with anything related to ownership or renting or anything that the city might have on file. So as an entity, you would not likely be noticed directly. However, your members would be, again, and sort of through that indirect route, you'd have the ability to participate. The difference with a recognized neighborhood association is that they would be notified directly through its leadership, as opposed to relying on the individual members to sort of filter that up to the leadership.
Yeah. So if you have, so really the neighborhood association recognition is basically started from a means to notice neighbors on zoning issues. Is that correct?
Madam Chair, Councilor Pena, I don't have that knowledge, to be honest, about what the original kind of thinking was or basis was, but I know that that's definitely part of the idea. I mean, I think sort of big picture, if the question is the city is going to recognize folks in some formal manner, and what sort of minimum standards should the city be looking at in order to recognize that group, so that the group can be sort of viewed as having a process that the city can rely upon relative to democratic processes or otherwise, such that when that group gets notice or represent itself before the city, you at least have some understanding of what process went into when they bring, what process went into their recommendations or decisions when they bring that before you.
Mm-hmm. So then legally, can we dictate how neighborhood associations operate if they're an entity? Can we, and somebody mentioned, NAIOP earlier and said, well, NAIOP comes in and whether they have influence or not, that's not part of my question, is that they come in, they're obviously, received notice somehow and it went up the chain and they can't come to council and they, want their voices heard. But they have their bylaws, their however they operate. So then by us asking neighborhood associations to operate in a certain manner, does that violate anything?
That's an important question. And I think the answer is no, but I think that it needs a little bit more explanation than that, because by asking neighborhood associations that want to be recognized to do certain things, it's essentially a voluntary act on behalf of that neighborhood association. If you want to receive the notice and the automatic standing under the IDO, then the city is going to ask you to operate democratically, to be inclusive, to have fair voting practices, to give appropriate notice to folks. And in exchange for that, if you're operating democratically and meeting those, checking those boxes, then the city is going to say, you are going to get notice above and beyond what would be legally required to do. And you're going to have the ability to participate without giving an extra explanation in land use matters about your interests. And so if a neighborhood association chooses not to do those things, then they can function in whatever capacity they want under whatever structure they want, and the city has nothing to say about that. But that's sort of a separate thing than what the narrow is attempting to do. So no, the city can't really dictate that, but it can say, to the extent that you want to participate in this program, here's what's going to be asked of you.
Councilor Pena, do you have any more questions?
I do. It's just that my computer laptop is actually doing that whole, it mutes itself again. So when you see me doing this, that's what's happening. So I apologize.
And then Councilor Gibson has questions after you also.
Okay, thank you.
Do you not have some follow-up, Councilor Gibson? Okay.
So,
go ahead, Councilor Pena.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So with that, so asking them to do A, B, C, and D in order to participate, can we dictate how they do A, B, C, and D? Being democratic, being,
Madam Chair, Councilor Pena, one of the historic kind of, I think, challenges that has occurred with the narrow is that there has been a lot of, I think, ambiguity in the guidance because it's historically the narrow has said you should conduct yourself democratically, but inevitably that is such a maybe an esoteric question, and democratic process can be viewed in perhaps differently through different lenses. And so what the narrow attempts to do is to identify what minimum practices, and there's only a handful. I mean, I think that if you were to maybe have a group of folks who are just, thinking about democracy and what those processes look like, that would be a very huge undertaking that might look something like, a constitution that is extremely complicated and detailed. But in this instance, I think what the narrow attempts to do, at least to the extent that it's consistent with the ultimate policy decision of the council, is to just identify a handful of things that would be the minimum benchmarks, so that neighborhood associations have clarity as to what the expectation would be, and that the city has clarity as to what its obligations are relative to recognizing folks. In other words, over time with the change of staffing or people, there's some value in having consistency of direction within the narrow, so that it's not a moving target as to what is meant by that democratic process. So I think that's really what the narrow is attempting to do, is identify a minimum handful of things, which, if met, the ONC has no discretion in denying recognition for, and a neighborhood association at the same time has full predictability in what will be asked of them.
So when we have organizations, so it's just kind of confusing, right? So I agree with what you're saying. I understand that. I mean, being part of the neighborhood association coalition for so long, I know there issues would arise, right? Like overlapping boundaries. Sometimes people didn't agree with the coalition that was there, and then they expanded their boundaries to overlap like the boundaries of Swan, and that's no ill respect to the West Side Coalition, but that was kind of a democratic process, right? I mean, they wanted to, so they kind of had the right to expand their boundaries, maybe because they didn't agree with our organization or whatever the case may be. And so now we're going to say that, well, now you can't do that, but it's just, so in doing this, I just want to proceed with caution. I just think that, that would be the reason why it would go to full council, because I'm looking at it like, there's other organizations, whether it be the Hispano Chamber, whether it be the Restaurant Association, they come and they have the same standing to me on level ground with neighborhood association, business groups, folks like NAP. And so yet those organizations maybe aren't required to have the same standing that neighborhood associations are. I'm just trying to work that out in my head in terms of how we view people that come before us. And sometimes some of the people that are with neighborhood associations come from marginalized communities, maybe not, whatever the case may be. But I want, them to be able to come to council and have their voices be just as loud as other organizations that don't necessarily have to meet these requirements. And if they do have to meet these requirements, then I think that the city should have kind of an allotment to be able to help neighborhood associations be able to carry out these expectations that the city has. And I would agree. I know that, sometimes people come, but it's the same from any of the other organizations that was described. Sometimes people, and I know this from being involved, is sometimes people speak for a louder voice than what they've really actually maybe reached out to. And then, but that holds true for other organizations as well. So we don't know that, like the Hispano had a vote and who voted and why they voted, or, so I'm just trying to iron that. I just want equity, and just to make sure that, again, people have those voices that otherwise wouldn't, and don't have the resources or ability that other larger organizations do.
Thank you, Councilor Pena. Councilor Gibson, a question, and then I would like to ask a question also. Councilor Gibson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So, Councilor Pena, the last few minutes of what you've been talking about is exactly why I think this narrow is important, and why many of the details in here are important, because we democracy isn't really so much about the majority, although we talk about majority rule, but it's to protect the minority. And this, I think that several of the elements in this ordinance does attempt to do just that. For example, noticing of an annual meeting or noticing of any kind of a meeting. There are several different ways to do that. I did just read this. I can't remember exactly, but it seems to me you have to do two of those things, like neighborhood signs, email, for example. So, and I can understand why a neighborhood association would have the perception that this was being heavy-handed. However, if you look at all of the options, they're the options that are commonly used. They don't say you can't do other things. You can do other things too. You knock doors, I suppose, if you wanted to. But those are commonly used, easy to use, fairly inexpensive to use. But I think without that element put in there, neighborhood associations, if left to their own devices, they just might send out an email to the email list and maybe not get everybody who has an email, or maybe there are some people who just don't use email for whatever reason, have it and don't use it. So I think that this and this I think is a pretty good example too, because I have seen this sort of pointed to as being an example of how NARO is trying to, take over neighborhood associations and dictate operations to them, when in fact it's you can also look at it this way: it is protecting my rights, my neighbor's rights, being included in that neighborhood association and the decisions that it may make. So there's that way to look at it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Gibson. And if I may move in with a question now, I would like to ask Petra and then Vanessa, talk to us about the process that was used too, since this seems to be a really some misconceptions and people aren't quite clear what happened here. Petra, would you like to start? Ms. Morris?
Madam Chair, councillors, yes. I believe that this process started with the NEP process, the neighborhood engagement process, which Vanessa will be able to speak to in much more detail about the pretty extensive outreach that was done through that. Then subsequent to the NEP, Councillor Benton reviewed the recommendations of that and worked with council staff to work those recommendations from the NEP into an initial draft of the NARO. That initial draft was shared with the public, with the neighborhood associations in January and February of this year. And then council staff went through the pretty extensive and very helpful feedback that we got from the community, and that information was worked into the revised NARO that you have before you this afternoon. And those comments were then worked in. So there has been both the formal NEP process, which Vanessa is going to be able to tell you, I think she's got it memorized and counts it in her sleep to help her fall asleep, all the different meetings and ways that people were engaged on that one, as well as the engagement that Councillor Benton did on drafting this NARO, and now the ongoing public process that is the council process.
Thank you. Thank you. And Ms. Baca, would you like to talk about this a little more?
Yes,
you could probably do in your sleep.
I think I can at this point, Councillor. Yeah, so the neighborhood engagement process was started in 2017. The intent was obviously to revise the NARO and make it updated. It hadn't been updated since its previous, when it was initially introduced in 1987. I think there had been very minimal updates. So
sorry if I may interrupt you because that went a little fast. When was this initially written?
1987 was when the original ordinance was voted into law.
With no substantial
very minimal updates. Yeah. And sure. The net process itself started when the city council contracted 2 independent consultants to do outreach to city councilors, to city departments, to neighborhood associations, HOAs, coalitions, and individual residents who were not affiliated with their neighborhood association. 222 neighborhood associations were contacted. 83 neighborhood associations did not respond to requests for information. The other associations that did responded in a variety of ways. They responded to flash polling, face-to-face interactions, some surveys that were done, a number of outreach events that were held at some of the community centers around town. And in fact, those outreach events were significantly where a lot of the feedback from the general public who were not neighborhood association affiliated came from. And from all of that data and information came the NEP reports that are available on our website and on the city council website as well, just basically summarizing the information that was gained by the contractors for the NEP process, incorporating the feedback that neighborhood association folks gave, and also incorporating ideas and feedback from the general public and from city councilors as well. So the contractors gave a presentation and an overview of their findings to the city council in November of 2019. And our office, me personally, informed all of our neighborhood associations that this was going to be taking place and invited them to attend so they could have the overview of what the NEP process found as well. And my office also published updates on the process in the neighborhood newsletter that was not sent out citywide, but available to all our neighborhood associations and the public citywide. And the updates to the NEP and the subsequent reports are available on the website as well.
Thank you. That's a lot.
Mhm.
I think that's, any other questions from the counselors? Counselor Benton, would you like to close on this?
Yeah, Madam Chair, thanks. I think the staff has seen the major points that were made, are recognized in the public comment, and I wanted to go through those briefly. But just to add a little bit more, as to NAIOP, I think that was one of the comments, both written and spoken today. As an example, that's a private organization. They do not have land use recognition or standing. So we do not get involved in how they operate. The same would go for any unrecognized neighborhood association or unrecognized coalition who wanted to form. It also goes for homeowners associations. One of the speakers spoke about that. We cannot get involved in that. The homeowner association is a private matter. If there's something happening within their association, of course, those individuals will have standing, but the association itself will not have a standing, and it's very different, and it's a unique recognition for neighborhood associations and now coalitions to have that land use case standing. And that's a big reason a lot of neighborhoods exist, to protect themselves from bad development or whatever it may be of concerns that have to do with the city. And we depend on that. I think that the city and the planning department, the council do depend on hearing from groups. But and if they come to a council meeting, I'm certainly listening to everybody who speaks. But if I hear from a recognized neighborhood association that has taken a position, that's a big difference from ad hoc groups or groups that don't want to have a democratic process, just want to do things their own way. That's totally their right. So that was one big one. I just wanted to give a little background on my involvement in it. Certainly with the passage of the IDO, this became important that we tackle this. Because the IDO did increase the potential standing of neighborhood association. So, and then we had a number of events back in 2017 where there were, I guess to put it mildly, an unfriendly takeover by one neighborhood association with the territory of another. And questions were raised in another case about just kind of the packing of a meeting with a group of people who made a formal decision, and that group also happened to be required to pay a dues to vote. And you know, with the Voting Rights Act, or years ago, the poll tax was amended long before the Voting Rights Act, I think, or preceding it. The poll tax was eliminated in the United States. I mean, people should not have to pay to vote. It doesn't prevent any neighborhood from charging dues. It's just that for specific votes of people within those boundaries, they do have to comply with those requirements. So,
Councilor Benton, may I ask one more question before you wrap up, please?
Please.
Mr. Melendez, there's a question about moratorium, putting a moratorium on this. Is that something that we would consider or could consider?
Madam Chair, it's the first I've heard of that proposal. Generally, a moratorium applies in the context of a zoning issue where the city is going to essentially put a pause on certain types of proposals within the community, land use proposals, in order for it to consider action that it might take to set better policy to deal with those types of proposals. I don't know if you want to clarify if you can clarify the moratorium issue, because I'm not familiar.
Madam Chair, if I could, they may be
Councilor Benton.
referring to the current special requirements for forming a new association. They don't prevent forming a new association, but there's been certain limitations on the formations of new associations since I think I can't remember exactly the year that started, but it had to do with this exact problem of overlapping boundaries and disputes of that sort.
I think, Councilor Benton, that was in 2017.
Yeah, so that has been and is still in place. Those do not prevent the formation of new recognized associations. But Ms. Baca could probably explain what it does do.
Ms. Baca, would you like to address that?
Yes, of course. The interim guidelines do not prohibit the formation of new neighborhood associations in cases where a neighborhood association would not have overlapping boundaries, or in cases where a neighborhood association would be forming in an area where there was only coalition representation. And in fact, we did actually allow the creation of a new neighborhood association in Council District 5 a year and a half ago, I believe it was, because they were in a very specific area where there were no neighborhood associations in any kind of proximity, and there was just coalition representation, and they wanted the ability to have that notification, get the notification. So we did allow the formation of that association.
Madam Chair, if I just add one, I think important qualifier to all the comments so far is that those limitations have been on only recognizing new associations. So if a new association wants to form and get the newsletter from ONC and get other services from the city, that's always been available. It's only the recognized that have been subject to the interim guidelines that prohibit essentially overlapping boundaries.
Thank you, Mr. Melendez. Unless there are other questions or more comments, I think I'm going to go to Councilor Benton to close on this, if you would, please.
If you don't mind, I would like to just review a couple of, and I was asking staff to kind of follow some of the comments, but during the public comment, the requirement for stating to a public body about how your decision was reached as a recognized association, that is already in place, if I'm not mistaken. Is that not correct?
Correct. It is in the current NARO, Councilor.
Yeah, we're not completely. Thank you. Yeah, so we're not completely starting from scratch. You know, many of the provisions in here were already in the NARO. So hopefully, everyone who's complaining about what we're doing at least know what is in the current NARO. But so that that is to answer that question. And then as to kind of stopping and starting over, it's been a 4-year process. Some of the people most loudly complaining about stopping and starting over are people who purport to support large groups of neighborhoods, i.e. the Intercoalition panel folks and other coalition people or people who spoke on the part of coalitions. I spoke to the coalition in 2017 and explained why we're doing this process for the West Side Coalition, and specifically Dr. Joe and one of the other folks, Ms. Adams, who spoke. And so, we had to depend, and with the outreach process, we had to depend on existing organizations. We could have some big meeting at the convention center and, everyone go up and speak, but that's not that's direct democracy is what we're being asked for. And unfortunately, that's not effective to come up with a new ordinance. So I did meet with the Intercoalition panel in December of 2019, right before the pandemic. I made a commitment that we would put out any draft, that they would be the first to see it, which we did when the first draft was finally released. We made good on that commitment. And once a draft is in place, I made clear that I wanted to hear from them about what's wrong with it and what they want to change. Give us specifics, as Councilor Gibson was saying. That's what's needed. But, calling us criminals and saying that whatever, this is the reason that something like a public meeting is not going to be effective. But that this committee process, I'm committed that it proceed. And Councilor Pena, I'm going to move for a deferral and keep it in this committee where we can, and hopefully we can get better participation from the public in the next meeting. Maybe we should do it at 5 o'clock. I'll just throw that out there. I don't know whether that's better or worse, but it's certainly, we've never had any intention of rushing this. To the contrary, it's taken a long time to get where we are. And we, some of the folks who wrote had very specific questions, with the ones regarding dues and having some alternative to that language. I'm totally open to it. And our staff is at your service to answer these questions directly. So I ask that folks who are speaking that want to have some big meeting, I just don't see how that's going to serve anyone. Not everyone can attend these meetings. Actually, this venue is probably more participatory than we've had in the past. But I want to say that there's never been any intention to ram anything through or that we're somehow railroading this. If Ms. Horvath, I believe, I hope her neighborhood is a member of their coalition, but I can't imagine that she'd never heard of this until now.
Councilor Benton, if you don't mind, are we okay with moving a deferral then?
Yeah, I'll move the deferral. I just want to be sure that I was hoping that staff might have made note of some of the specific questions and how we might deal with them. But I've asked the chair, and she's considering putting this on for a special meeting on, I think, the 25th. Is that right, Madam Chair?
I believe that's what we talked about. We still haven't confirmed that, but we'll certainly put out notice.
Yeah. So, that would be specifically for a second hearing of LUPS on that. All right. So that we can answer every question that's been raised thus far since the previous, round of comments. And then move this either without recommendation or with recommendation of the full council.
All right, so we will defer this until the 25th or whatever date we come up with, which we will publish. Is that where we are? Is that okay? I will second that motion. Counselor? There's a motion and a second to defer. All in favor, say yes.
Counselor Benton.
I can't.
Madam Chair,
Yeah, yes, Mr.
before you
Melendez.
take your vote, just to avoid any ambiguity, could you please clarify the motion? Because I think you have two options. You can defer to a date specific, which would be a second meeting in LUPS, and you would state that date today. If you want to preserve, that date, then you would defer to the next meeting of LUPS, in which case we would notice that meeting appropriately and place this on the agenda. And that would be either a meeting to be noticed at the end of September, at the end of August, or the first meeting in September. And it wasn't clear to me which one you were, Councilor Benton and Councilor Jones, you were moving and seconding.
Thank you, Mr. Melendez. Councilor Benton, do you have a preference on that? Do you want this a special meeting, or do you want it to be in the next LUPS meeting?
My request would be a special meeting on the 25th, and then this would go to full council.
I will second that. Councilors, any comment on that? All right, there's Councilor Pena, did you raise your hand? No, okay. There's a motion and a second to defer this ordinance till the 25th of this month. All those in favor? Yes.
Counselor Benton,
Yes.
Counselor Gibson. Counselor Gibson,
Yes.
Counselor Pena,
Yes.
Counselor Jones,
Yes.
and that passes on a 4-0 vote.
Thank you all. I know this is a really big issue for us, and Councilor Benton, I appreciate your cooperation with as much as we can get as much information out as possible. Thank you. Councilor
Madam
Gibson.
Chair, so checking my calendar, I have an AGO meeting on the 25th at 3 o'clock. 2 o'clock, I'm sorry, 2 o'clock. So, but maybe I'll try to get someone to substitute for me. Thank you.
Thank you. And there is also we have a LUPS meeting if needed on the 25th, so we could just put it in there, correct? Okay, so it will be scheduled unless there's other conflict for the special LUPS meeting, which we always hold for the second LUPS meeting on the 25th. Any comments on that? Everyone okay?
Madam
Thank you.
Chair,
Yes, sir.
if we could, if you would be so kind as to maybe poll the members of the committee. I don't know whether it's a possibility to do it at 5 or if they think that's a better idea. I'm just asking that maybe we collectively decide.
The LUPS meeting is scheduled for 5.
Oh, it is.
Yes, on the
Okay.
21st. So I would, or on the 25th. So I would recommend that we go with what we already have on the calendar, if everyone's all right.
Very good.
All right, thank you. Thank you. I think that takes care of that one, yes? Let's move on to Councilor Pena, and this is agenda item D, R182. Councilor Pena.
Thank you, Madam Chair. R182 is establishing corridor improvements for 118th Street from Interstate 40 to Senator Dennis Chavez Boulevard as a priority for the city of Albuquerque funding processes, encouraging the New Mexico Department of Transportation to prioritize the approval and construction of an interchange at Interstate 40 and 118. So I move a do pass.
There's a motion to do pass. I don't see a second. Councilor Benton, I see a second. There's a motion and a second on a do pass. Councilor Pena, would you like to give us any more information on that?
Yeah, just 118th Street, you know, there's always, when you look at the Southwest Mesa, I think it really describes it in the resolution. And the Southwest Mesa, the way it was developed is that there's these kind of like hub neighborhood associations that feed into these arterial roads that feed into major roads. And basically, all the roads in the Southwest Mesa happen to be state highways. So it makes it really difficult. And then those are limited access and don't allow for a lot of retail in the area. So we're really struggling for, you know, transportation, how to get in and out of the district. As you know, it's had an explosion explosive growth in the past, and that's really the only part of the city where we're going to grow into the future, you know. So we really have to look at some of the struggles that we're having, as the lady, Ms. Rivera, described earlier. If you live at 118th and Dennis Chavez, it's really a challenge to get to any near freeway, and you actually have to kind of go out of your way in order to get there. So, you know, this is in, I think, the 2040 plan, and I think if we pass this resolution, there's no funding associated with it. And what it'll do is it'll just encourage us to start to look at means on how to get it done, whether it be a study for funding, how much it's going to cost, those things associated with, you know, prioritizing the street. So I think it's an important road for the district moving forward. And if you are familiar with the way 118th is, it's pretty much just Mesa beyond that. And there's really a desire from the community members. They see illegal dumping. They have all the dust that comes in from the Mesa. And one of the number one things I get asked is that, you know, for 118th to go all the way to Central. And then the other thing is to really mitigate some of the issues that they're having because they abut the Mesa. There's, again, like I said, the illegal dumping, gunshots. So I think this would really encourage more infill in the area, which is good. And that's one of our priorities, is infill for the city of Albuquerque. But right now it's kind of a hodgepodge, and it is city and county. And one of the things that isn't in the resolution that I have an amendment for is the county is going to do the same thing. So they already have that in the works to ask for it to be a priority. It just wasn't stated in the resolution. So I have an amendment. I can move that now if you'd like.
If I may ask one question, Councilor Pena, would you consider that we do this without recommendation so the entire council can weigh in on this? This is a big issue, and I'm not saying I'm opposed to it in any way. It's just one of those things that this will be a lot of street funding to be moved around that other areas of the city need to. So I would think that perhaps it would be more appropriate for the entire council to be able to weigh in on it.
I would absolutely support that. So I would amend my motion to reflect that it would be to full council without a recommendation.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Are there any other questions or comments? Councilor Benton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I do support the intent of the sponsor in this and looked into it. And I think there's what my biggest question, I believe, is as Councilor Pena stated, that a lot of this is the county, and this is sort of the alignment of this road is almost a boundary between city and county, and some of it does go through county, unincorporated county, and a lot of it goes through the city, but certainly their plans and land use for the vacant parcels that abut, I think, is really important. And so not just the road planning or the support for a road, but rather what are the plans for development along here? Because I read the staff write-up and I totally agree that, you know, actually, if anyone remembers, I know Councilor Pena does, I represented the area for about 5 minutes at one time. and so I'm well aware of how difficult just shopping and getting basic services is on the Southwest Mesa. And so I fully support the idea that we try to get more small business and local type businesses. I know that big boxes are always interested the more we grow, and you probably need more of those too in the area, but that the access is very difficult. So, you know, I'd like to encourage that we talk to our respective planning departments, land use planning departments, as well as the transportation departments, and try to figure out what this would look like. I know that Western Albuquerque Land Holdings is also on the southern end. They own some of the property, and there are other large landholders who we don't really know. They're from, I believe, California, and that they own much of it as well. And just one other factor is, it was mentioned by Chair Jones that you know, these federal monies and these priorities are competing sometimes. But the important thing is that we recognize our city policy in general of expecting development to pay for roadways. So in this case, I think some sort of understanding of what those large landholders, not talking about small ones, but large landholders along the route would be expected to contribute. So I do see a lot of questions. I would prefer that this stay in committee personally until we can get those questions answered, and we can really, you know, the good thing about LUPS is we can really kind of dive in to the nuts and bolts of some of the proposals and what they mean, as opposed to just moving it on. I do think it merits more discussion. I support the motion of a no recommendation to council, but I would like to move a deferral until our next, I guess this would not be our next meeting if we're doing the special meeting, but it would be the one in October or September, excuse me.
Councilor Pena, I think that's something that you could respond to when we have one motion on the floor already. Councilor Benton.
Yeah, but this as a point of order, this supersedes the existing.
Councilor Pena, do you have a preference on this?
I don't think my preference matters. It's what Councilor Benton said, so it supersedes. So I don't, you know, I don't want to support it. I just think that, you know, and obviously it looks like it's going to stay in committee anyway, but I just want to say that, you know, I think some of the questions that you're talking about, Councilor Benton, can be addressed. You know, when we're looking at the levels of participation for the developer, as you stated, much of it is in the city. If you look at the eastern boundary, it's pretty much developed all the way from Dennis Chavez to Central, and it's all housing. Part of the problems that we're having is that we don't have these local areas of zoning. So I would agree with you in terms of the zoning. I don't think we can dictate what the county does in terms of zoning. So I don't know. I think we can add an amendment that says we'd encourage the county to look at, you know, future zoning for this area. So I would support something like that. And then, I mean, you know, when we talk about some of the issues that we're already and have historically had in the district, is that if we were even to build the street, there's still the impact fees, as far as I know, that would be added to the developer as they begin to develop that. And it's supposed to be to cover the costs of those things associated with it, right? So I think we'd still have that flexibility, but I don't think those impact fees would necessarily come back to the city, because they're, like I said, it's pretty much residential. And I don't think that we can turn around and ask everybody who is on the eastern boundary that their back of their house abuts this area to then now have to pay for the gutter and the like, right? So I think it's going to turn into more of a county issue. And then yeah, so you know, I would prefer to go to council without recommendation, and then maybe me and you can meet to discuss some of this. But I think it's just a priority all the way around. I've talked to Dewey Cave, and I know, you know, about other projects that are priorities for all of the councilors in the area. But, you know, talking to him and knowing that some of the federal dollars that are coming down, you know, he has mentioned that really one of the criteria is for them to really invest in areas that haven't been invested in historically. And the Southwest Mesa is, from what he's indicated, is one of those areas. So I think for us to, you know, just at minimum get the ball rolling, you know, this isn't going to happen overnight, but I think the discussion needs to be had. We're kind of locked in the area. There's not a lot of retail. Like I said, any of the major roads in and out are state roads. So we're having some tremendous issues. And I think that this being a actual non-state road, it would really benefit the community in lots of ways. Again, like Ms. Rivera mentioned, at 118th and Dennis Chavez, if you're there and you're having some issues and trying to get out and Dennis Chavez is closed and everything's backed up on Amole Mesa, you actually have to go west very, very far just to get to I-40. That's a long drive where there's nothing.
Counselor Pena, if I may, I think Counselor Benton's, and I know all of these things are very essential and important, but Counselor Benton, I think you have a motion on the floor that would supersede. And is there a second? Counselor Gibson has seconded that motion. Counselor Pena, we're going to get another chance or two to talk about this. So counselors, is a motion and a second to defer till the next meeting. So till September. All those in favor say yes.
Counselor Benton,
Get used to that one.
Yes.
Counselor Gibson,
Yes.
Counselor Pena,
No.
Counselor Jones.
Yes.
This item is deferred to September the 15th on a 3-1 vote. I'm sorry.
Thank you, everyone. I believe that there being no further business, let me first apologize for not having my full attention tonight. I will get back to Robert's rules next time. So the meeting is adjourned. Thank you.